Hello again, 110. In this particular video, I'm going to go over the study guide for the exam on chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8, which will be going on this weekend. Judicial restraint is when judges follow as closely as possible the letter of the original Constitution or the intent of the founders, and that's why primary source original documents like the Federalist Papers are still consulted by many justices and judges today to find out what that intent was. Again, restraint or activism is in the eye of the beholder, because the original Constitution, as we've discussed in previous videos, has that marvelous clause, the elastic clause, in which implied powers are derived. The Constitution is not static. It's not something etched in stone. It does change over time because mainly of that clause. So even Mr. Jefferson used implied powers when making the Louisiana Purchase. There's nothing in the original Constitution about land acquisition, but he did it anyways. He became activist when it suited his purpose. The Solicitor General has the greatest amount of influence on the court because it figures out what cases are going to be argued by the government. It issues friend of the court briefs or amicus curiae, and it will actually argue cases in front of the Supreme Court. How do they reach the court, legally speaking? By the writ of certiorari that we talked about in the last video. Declaring actions of the three branches unconstitutional is the idea of judicial review. The circuit courts exercise appellate jurisdiction or appeal jurisdiction over cases within their region. Most cases are heard at the state and local level. In the U.S., the original court is the trial court, then it'll go to district, and then appellate, and eventually to the Supreme Court. The plaintiff is the party bringing the charges. We talked about the three different types of law. Constitutional law is a major form of public law. You have to prove negligence or malfeasance, malice, to win a tort case. The lawyers blame the insurance companies for the costs. The insurance companies blame lawyers for all these various class action suits that have been brought. Tort cases usually, in the end, in the long run, result in a higher cost of living for most Americans. State and municipal courts hear most criminal cases because it involves some sort of moral transgression or ethical transgression. And civil cases involve some kind of monetary damages, usually. If the government at any level is bringing charges, then this is a criminal case. So U.S. will be listed first. Banking, credit, and currency is monetary policy. Taxing and spending are fiscal policies. This comes out of Chapter 7. The Federal Reserve System controls the nation's money supply through the raising or the lowering of the discount rate. In open market operations, the buying and selling of securities either adds to or subtracts from the money supply of the country. Theoretically, when rates are high, people borrow less, and that results in less money circulating in the economy. When rates are low, as they've been for much of this century, people tend to keep borrowing money and they keep spending it, and that keeps the economy rolling from a demand side point of view. Diplomacy is the primary task of the State Department. Historically, they were heavily involved in external security. In recent times, Homeland Security has been also involved with internal security. Historically, that was the FBI and the Department of Justice. The Internal Revenue Service is an important revenue agency, and they're involved in maintenance of the country. The first regulatory agency, this is just a fact, it was the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887. They were involved heavily in trying to regulate the first big business in America, the railroad industry. An example of an independent agency is the Central Intelligence Agency. Public opinion regulatory review, executive orders, and signing statements are used by the president when dealing with divided government. As has been stated, this is what we've had pretty much for the last 50 years. Divided government results from one political party controlling one branch and the other party controlling another branch. Say the Republicans today control the executive branch, and right now they are also in control of the Congress. This is a rare opportunity then for Republicans to try to push through legislation to their liking, as the Democrats did in 09-10 when they controlled both the executive and Congress. It doesn't happen too often since 1969. A government corporation example is the post office. The executive branch bureaucracy engages in administrative adjudication, where they apply rules and precedents to try to settle disputes among constituents. If this doesn't settle it to the satisfaction of those involved, then the court system, the legal system, will get involved. Rules of these agencies have the force of law. If the bureaucracy in these different agencies are going to have any teeth, they're going to have to engage in rulemaking, and that's problematic for a democratically oriented society, because these folks who work in these agencies are appointed and they stay. Administrations at the executive and congressional level will change, but these occupants of these agencies are there through all the different administrations. The bureaucracy actually carries out or implements laws passed by the Congress. And I talked about these iron triangles or pyramids. That really is where lawmaking goes on. The interaction between congressional committees, interest groups that we'll talk about in a later chapter, and the bureaucracy themselves. The inner cabinet has been very influential since 1947, especially the National Security Council has the ear of the president, sometimes to the detriment of the country. The cabinet makes up all those different departments: Secretary of State, Interior, Agriculture, Health and Human Services, etc. That was the traditional advisory group of the president. The modern presidency relies heavily on the advice of the White House staff, for better or good, because sometimes the staff doesn't have enough outside information when formulating policy. The Bush administration was dead wrong about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction, but unfortunately, many members of the staff, like Vice President Cheney and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, believed that this man possessed them, and they acted accordingly. A potential source of presidential control over federal spending is in OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. That particular office in the executive office formulates the yearly fiscal plan for the country, and combined with the Congressional Budget Office, those two groups will eventually hammer out a budget and they'll pass it or not. Executive privilege was clarified in the U.S. versus Nixon. In a 9-0 decision, there is no executive privilege in criminal cases, which is what Watergate was. The executive branch was involved in breaking and entering into the Democratic National Committee offices in the Watergate Hotel. An executive agreement is between the president and another country, and it's a way to get around the Senate approval of treaties. Whips in the House of Representatives attempt to enforce party discipline on voting on bills. Here are the judicial powers of the president. We talked about pardons, reprieves, legal forgiveness. Amnesty is usually given to a group of offenders, like the Vietnam War draft evaders by President Carter at the end of the 1970s. Constitutionally, war, the power to declare it, was the responsibility of Congress. Since the reorganization into the Department of Defense and the influence of the inner cabinet, most of the wars we've had since have been executive action wars. We talked about the most powerful person in the Senate, that is the majority leader. who presides over the House. The most important person there is the Speaker of the House. The Rules Committee is a unique part of the House of Representatives, and it can really determine the fate of many bills because it determines when they come to vote and what can or cannot be done with closed or open rules on the debate. Standing committees, there are many of them in the House of Representatives. Permanent committees, also in the Senate, and they're just in areas of a particular concern or issue. Today, the majority party by elections determines how the committee chairs are chosen. Historically, that was a function of seniority. It's no longer the case. A key staff agency in Congress is the CRS. This is a very effective group that will do research for the members, and if you're interested in finding out the fate of a bill, they usually know what is going on with it. An incumbent is the office holder. Incumbents hold the office for which they are running. One of the reasons for the Senate being given a longer term, 6 years, 2-4-6, 7-9-14, 25-30-35, is it insulates them from political pressure. And this is a more deliberative body. And as a result, they might engage in filibusters to try to stop a certain bill they don't like. And senators are reluctant to issue cloture or the 60 votes that needs to end a filibuster because they might want to use that tactic themselves some days. Voting as a delegate is doing what the constituents back home want. There's also the trustee vote, politico vote. You got to balance out being a delegate and being a trustee. I like that politico term. I really do. Closed rules means that you got to vote on something the way it is. You can't add anything to it. The United States Congress is the only national assembly that can actually be said to govern on this planet. Advice and consent is a special power of the Senate. Denying committee positions, limiting speech on the floor, log rolling, and the whip system are techniques for enforcing party discipline. And finally, the conference committee will be resorted to if the House and the Senate pass different versions of a bill. The House and Senate must pass the exact same bill in order for it to become law. There's also conference committees in usually Republicans within the House. And there's caucuses, usually Democrats, within the House as well. Good luck on this exam.